This meeting is being recorded.
I want to welcome everyone to another edition of the Northern New England chapter of SABR. I'm Bruce McClure, the chapter chair. We always hold our meetings in cooperation with the Gardner-Waterman chapter in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, in the early to mid 19th centuries, baseballs were made from various materials. Some of those materials might surprise you. By the early 1850s, the makeup of a baseball became part of the rules or laws of the game. And the materials used were a bit more stringent than just using anything lying around the house. By the mid to late 1850s, there were a few people making them for clubs, and by the mid 1860s, the number of baseball makers had grown quite a bit to accommodate the growing number of clubs who needed them. As time progressed, the ball changed in both size and weight, getting smaller and lighter. Corky Gaskell has been creating handmade replica 19th century baseballs for almost 10 years. And the hobby he took up to make these baseballs for his hometown 19th century baseball club has grown into a passion where he now has 19th century clubs from all over the country asking him to make some for them so that they can portray the game in a more historically accurate way. Tonight, Corky is sharing his passion with our group just as he shared it with the Fred Conference in 2019 in Cooperstown. Corky Gaskell, welcome to Northern New England, my friend. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Bruce. Thank you so much for that. If I wasn't the one presenting and I heard you read all of that, I'd want to attend myself and find out what's going on.
Thank you for that.
So thank you for inviting me to this. I do appreciate it. As you mentioned, my name is Corky Gaskell. I'm from Rochester, Minnesota. I joined SABR in 2019 and then was arm twisted by a friend of mine, Bob Tolkas, who some of you may know, who's a Minnesota man as well, to put together a presentation on making the baseballs. And so I begrudgingly signed up and fortunately was chosen to be one of the presenters and kind of been hooked on SABR ever since. I really enjoy listening to other people's presentations and fortunately for me, not many people talk about the actual ball. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get right into it. Let's see here. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so let's get into the basics. What is this thing called baseball? Well, two definitions. The first one is the game that we all know. We've got the bases, 4 of them, which makes the circuit for everybody to make it around in order to score a run after striking the ball. And then the second definition is the ball, the actual object that's used in the game. So the former definition really has been written about, studied by many people such as yourselves, much smarter than me. And we've learned about the game, how far back it goes, even before the 1800s. We've learned that there's various forms of this great game of baseball, whether it be the New York game, the Massachusetts game, town ball, and there's many others. We've also learned things that people were originally credited with inventing baseball, but the game, and we found out that to be a myth. We've also learned that there are others who have been credited with doing great things within getting baseball, the game, started, and that also turned out to be false. And we've also learned about the game that there was a club that we first thought was the first organized club in baseball. Well, that might not be true as well. The latter, while it's listed as a secondary definition, was that what was needed for all those people that are way smarter than me to have something to write about. So today I'm going to choose to talk about the latter, and hopefully it'll spark an interest to you to maybe help me find more data about this, what I will refer to as a precious sphere. So why am I into the baseball, the actual object itself? It kind of started, I joined my local 19th century club that Bruce referred to earlier. There was an elderly lady that was making the baseballs for us, and I thought that was kind of cool. And the baseballs were a little bit mushier than I cared for, but at that time I had no idea what the ball should have been in the 19th century. We just played with it, whatever she made. And then sadly she passed away, and the lady that ran our club asked for some of the players if they would be interested. And being a new guy, I raised my hand and sort of went through the process of learning how to do this. And in that research, as I was trying to find more information about making the baseball, I came across this gentleman that most, if not all of you, have heard of by the name of Doc Adams. And I started reading up on him a little bit and how he actually started out making some baseballs for his club as well, just so they would have something to play with. And if you look at the top right, that's an excerpt from Peter Morris's great book, But Didn't We Have Fun? And I kind of highlighted it there in the red. Had he not shown such dedication in the intervening years, the club may well have died for a lack of a functional baseball. And that kind of struck me as very interesting to have someone that maybe that important that if he didn't make a baseball, they weren't going to play. And that kind of got me a little more interested in making them. My club wasn't at risk. We had places we could go to buy these baseballs. And as I find out, they come from China. No offense to China, but that's not what an historically accurate game should look like, a ball made from China. So Doc went searching for a guy, and he found him, and I'm saying it's Van Horn, and we'll talk about the names of the guys that made him a little later, but he referred to him as a Scotch saddler in an interview from the Sporting News from 1896. That's the upper left article. And at that time, he didn't call him out by name. And so through some more research, if you look at the bottom left, which was from a Sporting Life interview, it actually named Van Horn, which that's a letter from Chadwick that was sent to Doc. And so not that was important, but it helped me to do some research now on some of these names, and you find one name and it leads to others. And so as the more research I did, if you look at the bottom right corner, it almost made me stop, because according to the article, it requires intelligence and skill. And I'm thinking, that ain't me. But I pressed on, and I continued to make baseballs. And really, because of what the interest I had in Doc Adams as I did my research. Now, kind of as a side note, I had started all this. I was probably 2 years into it, and a friend of mine through Facebook reached out and said, "Have you ever met Marjorie Adams?" And I said, "I don't know who that is." And he told me it's the great granddaughter of Doc Adams. I'm like, "You got to be kidding me." Well, long story short, Marjorie and I became very, very good friends. My interest in Doc really was something that she would use down the road as she did her presentations for Doc. She really trusted me to be able to help her with those presentations on what I found, and she helped me with mine. And I'm not going to spend the whole time talking about Marjorie, but finding her and making that friendship really was good for me to keep this thing going, because she drove me to do more and more research. So let's look a little bit at the timeline. And Bruce mentioned in the write-up, did I go too far? No. About how the ball got smaller and the ball got lighter. So this is kind of a timeline, if you will, of data that I have found where they specified in some form of a rule what the ball should be, whether it, from a weight and a size standpoint. So the first instance I found was 1854 in the Knickerbocker rules they had of that year. Rule number 17 specified 5.5 to 6 ounces and 2.75 to 3.5 inches in diameter. Now, I used some fancy math and converted that to a circumference, because later on, that's what they referred to in the size going forward, like in the Beatles dime guides and whatnot. So you can see there's quite a bit of a range when it comes to the size. 8.6 inches is slightly smaller than a modern baseball, and 11 inches is, I guess, slightly smaller than a softball, which I think it's 12 inches now. And so that's the first instance of a ball. And that makes sense because when you're making a baseball, depending on what you're using for the cover, that ball might be 8.6 inches or it might be 11 inches, right? Because whatever piece of material you have, you kind of stuck with that size. Then in 1856, the Putnams came out. They had a set of rules where they kept the weight the same as the Knickerbockers did, but they made the top end a little bit smaller. So the 2.75 stuck, which is the 8.6 inches, and then it dropped to 3.25 inches in diameter, which is just over 10 inches at the top end. And so 1857, the first laws of baseball that Doc Adams and team put together, we got a little bit heavier, 6 to 6.25 ounces, but we kept that size to about 10 to 10.25 inches in circumference. Now you can see, I'm not going to read each of those lines, but you can see that ball getting smaller over time until 1872, where now we're between 5 and 5.25 ounces, 9 to 9.25 inches around. And that has not changed. That is what a modern baseball specification is. And you can see in the white box at the bottom, a modern baseball rule book specifies that exact same size and weight. So really the only thing that's changed since 1872 is how hard the ball is. And we'll get into that a little bit when we talk briefly about moving into machinery used for the ball. Everything I do is handmade, no machines. And that's where my focus is with a handmade baseball. You'll also see just above the white box, there's a reference there. Massachusetts rules game, for those of you familiar with that, you can see it's between 2 and 2.75 ounces. That's pretty light. And 6.5 to 8.5 inches circumference, kind of small. And for those of you that follow that game, understand that when you're soaking or plugging, meaning you're hitting the runners with the ball, that makes more sense. And we'll talk a little bit about how that the ball changed in the Massachusetts game as well. So we talked about the ball getting smaller, but we haven't really talked about why that is. And so this is just an excerpt that came out of a great reference book, the 19th century winter meetings. Every year that there was a baseball convention, if you will, there's a chapter in this book that talks about what changed. And in this particular 1859 meeting, Mr. Voorhees made that amendment that, we want to just get a little bit smaller. And even the New York Clipper agreed that the present ball is too heavy and too large. And you'll see this reference to the number of fingers knocked out of joint. The references to injuries is really the driving factor for making the ball smaller. And here's a little bit more. I'm not asking you to read this whole thing right now, but the extent of it is you can see where my red underlines are, that all the different references to injuries or something. And so why did the ball get smaller? Why did they end up and choose the weight that they came up with? And some people will argue this, but it's basically in that section in the blue circle on the left. Is cricket came up with a ball that was 5.5 ounces in weight, 9 inches in circumference. And that's really pretty much a modern baseball size and weight. And they have found that they've had quite significant less injuries due to that. And so it's kind of my opinion that the way cricket was playing with a little bit harder ball, but smaller and having less injuries is kind of a driving factor for that. And what was interesting, as I mentioned before, the Massachusetts ball was quite a bit smaller. And here they are getting together saying, maybe we need to make our ball a little bit bigger. And what I found interesting was, they didn't really specify how big. They just wanted to increase the size and the weight. And they never mentioned how it might impact with the plugging or the soaking. And to me, that would have been an important thing, that if you make the ball too much bigger, too much heavier, the players are going to revolt, getting hit with a bigger and a little bit harder ball, or heavier ball, if you will. I got a message here I need to fix. Or is that not on my screen? Is that warning message showing up for everybody or just me? Is anybody there?
What's the warning message?
It says the screen is currently not set. If you're not seen, oh, there it goes. It was weird. It showed up on my display, but not on my laptop. Anyway, I apologize. So who were the people that were making the baseballs? The first two that I found reference to, and this is people, or these are people that were making more than just for a single club. So I talked about Doc Adams. He was making them. He wouldn't be considered a manufacturer. He just made them because, his team needed them. But Harvey Ross and John Van Horn were the first two really that I've researched that made a good number of baseballs, and they were different. So Ross, he was more of a dead ball manufacturer. He only used about 1.5 ounces of rubber, and I don't know if it was because his Atlantic club liked that kind of a ball. That's generally what we find as we go forward, is teams that like a lighter or a less lively ball generally are like really good fielding teams. They don't have a lot of big hitters. And then those that would be more drawn towards a lively ball like Van Horn would have made, because he used, between 2 and 2.5 ounces of rubber. They usually had the bigger hitters, and they wanted a ball that was going to carry a long way. So the other thing I want to mention here, because it will come up later, is sheepskin was really the choice to cover a baseball in the early years. And I'm not going to spoil that, but I have made some with sheepskin just to see. But Van Horn was really probably the leading producer. He made more, at least from what I could tell, than Ross did. And I don't know if it was because his was a livelier ball, or he just had a better product, or a better way to make them. But he also was known to use up, cut up some old rubber shoes for the core as well. And when we get into the materials, you'll see how that changed over time as well. But between those two, between Ross and Van Horn, they supplied most of the baseballs from the late 50s into the very early 60s, until such time the number of clubs grew so much that more people had to get involved. Now, the next set of names, these aren't really listed in any order. They're just kind of as I found them through the research. But a gentleman by the name of Edward Horseman made baseballs, and he, instead of just making some or all dead or all lively, he came up with a way to make both. He had some lively and he had some dead as well. Harrison Harwood and Sons, that name is probably more familiar to some of you from Natick, Massachusetts. Their name is kind of in the discussion of who invented what we call the current figure 8 cover baseball, and whether or not they were the ones to invent it really isn't that important to what I'm talking about. But they were one of the first mass producers of it, and that didn't happen until the late 1860s, even though the invention took place in the late 1850s. And I'll just take a moment to, I don't have facts on this. I've never seen anything printed as to why it took them 10 years after the invention to bring this to bring out the figure 8 ball. But what I'll tell you from my experience in making them, because I have tried to make them by hand, again, no machinery, the two pieces of that figure 8, it's a two-piece baseball that folds together. They have to be dead on exact with the size, with the cut, with the punching of the holes. And so my theory, that's the word I was looking for before, my theory is that someone eventually invented like a punch that they could put down on the leather, hammer it down or press it down, so it would cut each of those pieces exactly the same. Because if they're not, when you start to sew it up, and I'll show you the pictures, it doesn't go well. And so that's just, again, that's me theorizing as to why it took so long, is because they just didn't have a good way to cut those two pieces exact. When you're dealing with what we call today a lemon peel ball or the 4-petal ball, you have a little leeway. Everything doesn't have to be exact. I think the ball comes together nicely. And that's why it was a more popular ball. So I digressed. A gentleman by the name of Rice from New York, I never did find his first name, but he sold out to Brock. And Brock was an interesting story, is that he basically sold everything he owned to get into this baseball making business in the early 70s. Peck and Snyder was another one we've heard about. They also dabbled in baseball cards. They came out in 1870 with what was called the dead red ball. Chadwick was pushing for that. The ball was getting a little too lively. So it was actually red in color and a dead ball. Whiting, I don't know much about him. The only way I found him was the ad kind of off to the right, the ball play ad. His name was in there as a manufacturer of baseballs. And then George Ellard, who was, again, a little more popular, but he made them for the Red Stockings Club. And as I mentioned before, the clubs that were great fielders, not big heavy hitters, really liked a lighter ball, one that didn't travel quite as far. So Ellard made those for the Cincinnati Red Stockings, and there's stories you can find when they would go out east to play teams in Brooklyn and whatnot, the complaining that would happen of them using one of theirs balls, and the Red Stockings complaining that, oh, the Brooklyn teams use a too lively ball. That was a thing, that happened. And then underneath the dotted lines there, this is now getting into the timeline of where I'm not spending as much time, but I did run across these guys. They had some name recognition and also had some interesting ways of making the baseballs. Louis Mann, he was from Boston, and he was the official ball of the American Association. And he also made, which I thought was kind of interesting, a double cover ball. So they were having some trouble with covers ripping or tearing or whatnot, and they don't want to have to take a ball out of play. So he actually put a cover on, then put another cover over the top. It didn't last. That invention didn't take off. And you don't really hear much about it, but it was an interesting concept. Then Spalding, who we've all heard of, the official ball of the National League in 1878. And then A.J. Reach, he really was one of the first into the mass producing using machinery. And he had a guy by the name of Ben Scheib working for him who I'll say invented, but came up with a lot of the designs for the machinery that they did use when they started mass producing using machinery. Through the manufacturing using machines, they would find, it's kind of like anything you make. You get some really, really good ones and you get some really, really bad ones. And so when you look at some of the advertising for some of the Reach baseballs back in the day, the good ones, you'll see, a dozen for, I don't remember the prices, but I'll just say a dozen for $1. And then all of a sudden you'd see an ad for a dozen baseballs for 10 cents, because they were the rejects that didn't quite make it off the line in the proper way. So they're just looking for a way to get rid of them. And then Spalding bought out Reach in 1883. So what goes into the baseball? And I start with the baseball core. And in this case, if you read through the Beatles dime guides from 1860 through 1877, you'll see they call out India rubber as what goes into the middlemost of the ball. And India rubber comes from a tree similar to how you would get sap out of a tree if you wanted to make maple syrup. You would, drill the hole in it. The India rubber would come out into these round cakes, and then they would take those as they hardened and use a knife and just cut them into strips, and then that would be as they wrap those strips around, that would form the core of the ball. Now for those clubs, and this was something I found really interesting, and it's something that I'm curious to try if I can ever find somebody. On the upper right, if you lived in the lake regions and you were a fisherman, you might catch a sturgeon fish and use the eyeball of the sturgeon fish. And as they say, it's a flexible enough substance, rebounds if it's thrown against a hard base. So to me, it would be similar to what we would call a bouncy ball or something like that. And so I can't imagine using them in a game, but you never know. And if I ever find someone that catches a sturgeon, I'd love to get the eyeball and make a baseball and see what happens. Then in the bottom left, you'll see that they also, and I mentioned this earlier, they would cut up old rubber shoes into strips. And here's where you see Van Horn using between 2 and 2.5 ounces of rubber, cover it with yarn, and then you use sheepskin for the cover. And so in 1871, you'll see at the bottom left in the bottom section of that, they talk about vulcanized rubber. So when it says, then came the small 1 ounce ball of vulcanized rubber, they're referring there to 1872. So in 1871, they limited it to 1 ounce, but it could still be strips of rubber wrapped around. In 1872, it was 1 ounce, but it had to be vulcanized. And that just means it was heated and formed into a solid ball. Again, a bouncy ball, or eyeball of a sturgeon, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. So then in the bottom right, William Vogel had an article that he wrote, The History and Manufacture of a Baseball. And here again, it talks about using, and here he says 2 ounces of rubber to form the strips wrapped around to make the round ball, and then wrapped in coarse yarn, and then wrapped in fine yarn. So we've got the rubber core. We're now going to wrap it in yarn. And you'll see bottom left, it talks about woolen yarn substituting for cotton. So they started with cotton. You'll see in the bottom right one that for Vogel, a coarse yarn followed by a fine yarn kind of thing. So we now understand what materials they're using. And so I'll mention this a little later, why they switched from cotton to wool. But it does make a difference, and that I've learned as I make mine as well. But the other thing I want to note, the bottom right, where they now talk about covering it with horsehide. And I mentioned earlier, sheepskin was the material of choice early on. And what they were finding was the sheepskin didn't hold up. It's really, really thin. It's too thin for a baseball. If I sold one of my sheepskin baseballs that I've made for a club to use in a game, I don't think they'd get out of the second inning without that thing ripping apart. Part of it is because there's so many big hitters now in our game, and I don't know how big the hitters were back then. I don't have that way to judge, but I've seen some of the guys hit the ball now and the cover would just fall off. That sheepskin is so thin. So again, we'll continue on with the core. Here, they talk about the layer of cotton yarn. Again, we're back into cotton yarn. But they mention that as tightly as strength would allow. And that's really important, because you can make a baseball without wrapping a ball tightly at all. But it's going to be like a Nerf ball, right? If you don't put some strength behind that wrap, the ball's going to be so soft it just won't go anywhere. And so he talks here a little bit about, this is from the Chicago Tribune, if they're all made of cotton yarn, they get a little harder. The woolen yarn will allow it to soften up a little bit, or they use the word mellow here. They mellowed. And so it was easier on the hands. And so when I make my baseballs that I either play with my team or that I sell to other clubs, the outer layer, I use the woolen yarn. The reason I don't use wool for the whole thing is when I do, it goes beyond the weight requirement for some reason. And it also gets really, really expensive. So it's like 4 or 5 times as much as cotton yarn, and nobody wants to pay more for a baseball than they already do. And I found that putting that outer layer in wool really serves the purpose of what we need for today in our games. And you can see in that picture they had what's called a stitching horse, and it just was a way to place a ball, have it held in place as you're winding the yarn. And then you'll see him. He's got like a piece of a 2x2 or something, a mallet, if you will, and they would pound it as they go, and that helped harden it too, because it stretched the yarn a little bit, and they were able to pull it a little tighter. And then I got a note there in 1888. This is when the winding machine came into play, which really allowed them to get the ball even harder. And that's, like I mentioned before, the ball didn't change size or weight after 1872. It just got harder. And this is how they were able to do it, through that winding machine. And I put a little note in the bottom right. The core is what determines how lively that ball is going to be. And there were controversies between teams of their ball's too lively, the ball is too dead. It was a thing. It was a thing they talked about. So what do we use for the cover? There's different styles of cover. There's been different materials. This particular page, we're going to talk about the look or the style of the cover. So in David Block's book, Baseball Before We Knew It, there's a reference that from a John Montgomery Ward article, or I don't know if it was a book or an article. I got it from the Hall of Fame library. But they refer to it as a pedal-shaped leather cover. And the pedal shape, and I got a picture on the next page, I think. We'll talk about that. But it's what modern vintage ball players refer to as a lemon peel. And just so everyone knows, lemon peel is not a historic term. It was never used in the day, if you will. It's a modern made-up term, but people recognize it and they know what that means. But it also, then from the Brooklyn Herald, when they're talking about baseball, this gentleman refers to the old star pattern. And again, it's the same thing. It's whether it's a pedal or a star, it's got the four petals with points at the end. It kind of looks a little bit like a 4-piece star. And it also references now going to the 2 strips of leather, cut something like a figure 8. So you see that term, a figure 8, used even back in 1888. And then the one down below it, here you see it referred to as 4 semi-ovals, still in one piece, which is the same, shaped like the petals of a flower. So now we're talking about that same thing again. And then now they refer to the modern 2-piece cover again, which is what we call the figure 8, but in here they call it a continuous seam. And that continuous seam is, makes sense because once you start sewing up or stitching it up, it's one continuous seam all the way around. And off to the right, you'll see some pictures of various baseballs from the 19th century. For those of you that know Tracy Martin, he has a baseball museum. He's out of Columbus, Ohio, and he shared some pictures with me of some of the baseballs that he has. Pretty cool. It's interesting to see the styles and the materials and the cover patterns they used back in the day. Again, as I mentioned before, lemon peel is a modern anachronism, if you will, and it should be orange. It should be an orange. And so I found many articles that reference that. So the one on top, and this came out of the Putnam rules, it's made of yarn wound. Here they used a lump of cork or India rubber. Now, remember the Putnam rules were 1856, I believe, so it was before the laws of baseball said had to be India rubber. Here they used calf skin in quarters as we quarter an orange. And so, to me, that was interesting. Now we've got this old 4-petal or star pattern, and here we are talking about 4 separate pieces that we quarter an orange. And then if you get into Peter Morris's book again, but Didn't We Have Fun? He's got it as well, the same form that an orange peel takes when neatly prepared for dessert. Now, evidently oranges was a dessert item back in the day. I get it. But when you would cut it, it would go into 4/4. And so here we are with a lemon peel baseball. And so it's now up to me to get them to change that. We got to start calling it the orange peel baseball. And then in the New York Sun, they wrote an article, again, calling it 4 pieces. And they actually had a picture of that, of one of the pieces. And so in the bottom, I kind of highlighted in blue because it talks about quartering of an orange. And then afterward came a different style of cover, which was supposed to obviate the tendency to rip. And so these baseballs made with 4 pieces not only had each of the seams as a potential place to rip, but now where instead of in a quote unquote lemon peel ball where it came together at the top and had one break point, this now was going to have a break point at the top and the bottom because those 4 petals are now coming together in 2 separate spots. So they're referring to the star pattern baseball in the blue, and then in the green finally came the pattern of today with the curving edges so gracefully rounded that it's so seldom, when sewed, seldom tears loose. And they're referring to that continuous seam or figure 8 ball. So they kind of covered all 3 of them just with that one paragraph, which I found interesting. So that orange peel ball was a thing. And of course, what I have found when I make them is that it helps me reduce scrap, because sometimes I would just throw certain pieces away that weren't big enough for a 4 petal or star pattern baseball. And now I could save some of those pieces, cut them in four sections, and make baseballs using those. So here's some patterns, if you will, of the cover and different ones. I got a couple pages of these. The one across the top, and all 4 of those across the top are basically the same baseball, but in the history and manufacture of baseball that William Vogel put together, and I mentioned him earlier, he had this pattern drawn, which I thought was really interesting because you see the 2 pointed petals, but the other 2 are cut off square, which I thought that's kind of weird. How is that going to go together to form a baseball? So with some trial and error making that pattern, I was able to reproduce one. But you can see in the second picture from the left that I got circled there in blue, you can see how the V comes together at the top, and there's a V that comes together towards the bottom, and then a line that goes between them. So instead of those 4 points coming together at one point, this now has 2 points coming together at 2 spots with a stitching line between them, which doesn't make any sense at all, because to me that's adding more breakpoints to the ball. But that was a ball that they made, and that is actually a picture of a ball. In the third picture, you can see it. It was actually a trophy ball that they had from the Delaware State Championship of 1866 that the Diamond State Club won. And then there's a little article off to the far right. I don't have the whole article, but you can see the baseball. A picture of it from back in the day, 1941, when that article was in the paper. It's a tough picture because of the glare, but that was a ball that they used in the game. They made the trophy ball out of. So that was kind of interesting. So of course I see that, and I've got to learn how to make it. Across the bottom, you see what's called a belt baseball, and it's actually 3 pieces. And again, this allows you to use scrap. It's 2 circles and a rectangle, basically. You've got to get the circle size to be perfect with the belt size, and you got to get all the holes to line up. And this took me about 8 tries to try and get to where it worked out. I don't have an old belt ball I can tear apart and copy a pattern from. This is now you got to start from scratch, just like the one above. It's kind of start from scratch and try and figure it out. But it's also referred to as a gusset ball. And it's, to me, the only reason you would make this ball is because you had some scrap to get rid of. It's a son of a gun to make. And it's again, a lot of break points, a lot of spots for it to come apart. So these are some examples of my patterns, and it's just a few of them. Off to the left, you can see some of the math I do to try and get this to work out. The second one from the left is the ball that I mentioned earlier from the Delaware State Championship, and you can see below the pattern where the red lines are. That's one that I made. I finally got to work out with that style of pattern. The next pattern is for making a belt ball, the 2 round circles and the rectangle. You can see I had to write the number represents how many holes I came up with equally spaced around that circle, and I had to make sure that there was that same number on the rectangle, or otherwise this doesn't work. The second from the right is a typical 4-petal or star pattern, and I've got 6 or 7 different sizes, one for every year where it changed. I've got patterns. And then to the far right is my dabbling with the figure 8. And this is one where I finally got a cut pattern that I could rely on to make 2 pieces together to get that ball to form. And you can see the ball above is one that I made using that pattern, which turned out to me pretty good. It's way better than the first one I did. So trophy balls, as I mentioned, is another big thing. And trophy balls are basically when 2 teams played, the winning team would get the ball. And one of the best examples from the Hall of Fame is the Eckford baseball trophy case, where they kept, assumingly they kept, all of their winning baseballs, wrote on them, when the game was played, what the score was, and so on, and put them in this trophy case. Now, I'm not going to say that's all of them. I know it's not all of them, but it's a good selection of baseballs. And as far as I know, they're the most well-known trophy case, team trophy case of baseballs that we know about. But there was also a nice selection out in Harvard, and a dear friend of mine from your area, Brian Sheehy, with the Essex Baseball Club, got me hooked up with Devin Horahan out at Harvard, who took some pictures for me of some of the trophy balls that they have in their case. Now, the Eckford ones, some of them are lemon peel, if you will, 4-petal ball. Some of them are, the later ones are the figure 8. The ones in Harvard generally are almost all the figure 8 or continuous seam baseball. And you can see the years on there, 74, 70, 73, 69. So those are later when that figure 8 ball was coming out. Upper right corner in 66, that's one of the few 4-petal balls that they had in their trophy case. And you can kind of see how it's quite a bit more deteriorating than some of the figure 8 balls. So how do we stitch these things up? This was by far the hardest to find data on. I mean, I found next to nothing. It was really hard. And so what I did find, though, was quite interesting. If you look on the upper left, underlined, it was men they employed for the purpose of stitching the cover over the ball. And I didn't quite understand why that was. They wanted to point that out. But then you go look over to the top right out of the Brooklyn Eagle, where they were sewn together by girls. So now I don't know who to believe. It's darn media, I tell you. But later in that story, the balls were wound by men. So that makes a little more sense, that they were wound by men when they were handmade, because of as we saw in one of those earlier posts, the stronger you are, the more strength you can get wrapping that ball, the tighter it'll be. And so that made a little more sense to me. But the stitching up made no sense as to why they would say it needed to be a man or a woman. But here you have it. They all did it. And then as far as what they used for sewing on the cover, and this was really it was the only instance I found where they mentioned the material. Problem was, this was for the figure 8 baseballs, which came later than what I'm trying to do with my 4-petal balls. But they talk about a red or a white Irish flax linen, why the players preferred red. I would guess it makes it easier to see the ball, but so that's this flax linen is what they used when they were stitching up the ball. when I look at some of the pictures from Tracy Martin's museum, it looks like for some they actually use twine, and it's much thicker than what we would think of using today, but that's probably what they had. It wouldn't surprise me if they used a shoelace or something back in the day either. So this is my display that I've put together for the various types of baseballs that I've made. Starting off on the left, the first year that we had defined with the size of a baseball. It's, that's a big baseball. Nobody would want to play with that today. It's just too big. And then you can see the 57, 58, that's, the first laws of baseball. That's what the size was. We get into 59 and 60, and you can see on those I used the darker material, the darker leathers, because that was more what was typical of the day. They didn't have a way to lighten the leather yet. 61 to 67. Now here we went 7 years without the ball changing size or weight. So they were getting very comfortable with the ball size at that time. Then the one next to that is just kind of thrown in there. It's New England or Massachusetts ball. And you can see how much smaller it really is. You get the visual now of how much smaller that ball was. And that ball was made towards the higher end of the range. So it could have gotten even smaller. Then we get into 68 and 70, 71, 72. And then the next one is the modern continuous, I call it modern, but the continuous seam. You can see that one is not a very good looking baseball. I really struggled making these. And so the picture down below is the one I most recently made, where I've kind of figured things out now. But it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but the one in the display, there's just a lot of puckering of the leather because the holes didn't quite line up and the two pieces didn't quite line up. And I tell you, I got frustrated. And all I could picture were people back in the 1858, 1859, when they came up with the idea, just screaming at each other that it wasn't working because that's what I was doing. Then an actual modern baseball, just for the reference. Then the one to the right of the modern baseball is one using sheepskin. And you can't really, it just looks like a baseball, but that leather is so thin. When I was stitching that up, I was so afraid that when I pulled tight that it was just going to rip those holes right through. So I had to be really, really careful. And then the next one is a 2-piece 4-petal ball. And then the one to the right is the orange peel ball. So you can't see the other side of it, but the other side looks just like the front side. So you can see those two sides each has a break point. And then I made a belt ball for fun. And then really for fun, I made a golf ball. I made a lemon peel 4-pattern golf ball. Why did I do that? Well, because I could. And what made it interesting is that a friend of mine who golfs, I actually gave him one, and he played 18 holes of golf with it. Now, it didn't carry as far as a golf ball, of course. I wouldn't expect it to. It didn't roll on the putting green quite as smooth as a golf ball, but I wouldn't expect it to. But it held up, and so that I was pretty happy about that. I've also used the handmade baseballs to meet celebrities and do special events. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I'll just let you know a little bit about what I've done with this. I use it as an opening, if you will, to get more people interested in 19th century baseball. So upper left, you're wondering why do I have a picture with that guy? He doesn't look like a baseball player. That's Dan Gable. He's not a baseball player. He's a wrestler, but I took advantage of it and introduced him to 19th century baseball. Then you'll see me in my Knickerbocker Doc Adams uniform. I'm at the Field of Dreams. The Field of Dreams had somebody vandalize their field, and the VBBA, you can see the flag in the background, or Vintage Baseball Association, made a donation to them to help get their field back in order. And since they're just 3 hours south of me, I made the trek down and met with one of the ghost players and presented them with a check from VBBA. Upper right, the baseball, and the picture of the gentleman is Delaney Walker, who played in the National Football League. At the time was a tight end for the Tennessee Titans. So we're in Tennessee for a conference, a baseball conference, and he walks up, and I'm standing there trying to think, how do I go up and ask this guy for an autograph? He walks over to me and my wife and says, you guys look cool in those uniforms. Can I get a picture with you? So he ended up asking us. He put that picture on Twitter, and in 10 minutes, there were more people liking that picture than I've ever liked a Facebook post or Twitter post of mine. It was crazy. That's Delaney Walker. In the left center, the pink one, I donated some baseballs I made to the Essex organization, Essex Baseball Organization. They do a breast cancer awareness event, and they auction those baseballs off. Bottom left, the black baseball with the red striping that looks like a Massachusetts ball. I put together some YouTube videos on how to make a baseball, and this was the first response I got from those videos. And the guy holding that baseball is actually in Germany. He saw the videos and said, "I'm going to try and make a baseball." Actually, did a pretty good job. The bottom row, second from the left, with all the red stitching. A neighbor of mine, who was I think 14 at the time, ended up with brain cancer and had surgery done. And on the back of his head, he had those stitches. And I said, "Connor, I'm going to make a baseball for you that has those stitches on it." So that was a present for him as a reminder that he beat cancer. And then my favorite one's the bottom right. That's Joe Mays and Byron Buxton from the Minnesota Twins. And what I like about it, and I'll get you zoomed in on a closer picture, is the look on Byron Buxton's face and Joe Mays' face as they look at that 19th century baseball getting ready to sign it. And I spent the next 3-4 minutes explaining 19th century baseball as quickly as I could with the line of people behind me. But it piqued their interest. And I thought that was pretty cool, that their interest in it. So that concludes what I've got to present. And so, Bruce, I think now we'll just open it up to questions.
Absolutely. We had a couple of good questions that were in the chat. I'm going back through. Susan Nelson asked about the winding machine. She wanted to know if that was hand turned or mechanical.
The one that I found that Ben Scheib worked on was all mechanical. Now you had to set it up by hand, get everything lined up, and then once it spun, it was spinning on its own. Now, is that to say there wasn't a hand wound one before that? I don't know the answer, Susan. Mm-hmm. I can see how possible, it's very, very possible that was, but I've never found that article if it exists.
Meredith Wills asked for a reference list. Maybe you two can connect directly with
a reference as far as
can Corky provide a list of references afterwards? This is fascinating. Or most from the Hall of Fame library.
Okay. Yeah, what I can do, is that Meredith?
Yes.
Actually, for anybody, I can send out my presentation. Every single article has a reference as to where I got it. Okay. Whether it was the New York Times or the Sporting News or somebody's, John Montgomery Ward's.
Okay.
We're going to auction these baseballs off now. The books, and so I am more than willing to share that, but they're all noted in the presentation, and I'll send that to whoever wants it. So I'll just let you guys know. Bruce has my email. Yep. You can get it from Bruce, and I will be happy to either send it to Bruce to distribute, or if you want to reach out to me directly, once you get it from Bruce, I'll send you that presentation, and you can see all the references to where I got it.
This program will also be posted on YouTube within 48 hours.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So if you go back on YouTube and watch it, as the screen pops up, you'll see every reference, on the screen. You can pause it, write it down if you want. But either way, it's not that I don't want to send it, but it might be easier for you just to go page by page and see those references. I'm one of those that won't put it in a presentation unless I say where it's from. And when I do say it's my theory, then I don't have anything. It's just my theory.
Let's go to Dixie.
Corky, great presentation.
Thank you.
I have to take back what I said before. Not only was I at the 2019 Fred, I have 25 pictures of you giving your presentation.
Wow.
So if
25,
if I can get your email address, I can send you all those pictures.
Okay, I'm gonna pop it in the chat. And actually everyone should be able to see that. And if, not that you all gonna have pictures of me, but if you do want to reach out for any further information, I'm happy. I check my email quite often, but
And a
I'll
short question is, was your name Corky before you made baseballs? Because it certainly is an appropriate name.
yeah. So what's interesting at the Fred, you probably don't remember this, but Peter got my name mixed up when he was putting all the information out. I was Gary Gaskell for that presentation. So everyone thought I was Gary, but so no, Corky is a nickname that I've had all my life. It's my given name is Charles. It's the same as my dad. I'm not a junior. You know, my dad was Charles. He was Charlie. He was Chuck. He kind of took all the nicknames. And so I got the nickname Corky off of my middle name, Corwin. And that was my dad's best friend when he was a kid. So it's just stuck. I've been Corky. It's better than being India Rubber, I guess. That's kind of
I know the feeling.
Any other questions for Corky tonight?
This is Kate. I grew up in Natick, Massachusetts, and I remember the Howard baseball factory in downtown Natick. And I've not been back in years, but I don't know if it's still standing, but I remember it was a gray building with red letters.
Yes, it is still standing. Yes,
Yeah.
I drove by it every day on my way to work, and I would stare there. You know, it's right in the square. I'd have
Yeah.
to take a right turn, but I would look straight at that building. New Empire, it is still there, and it's a set of probably luxury condos.
Oh, everything is now luxury condos, but
I know,
remember
really, yeah,
I know,
really
and
is.
Took
growing
the
up
words
there
right
in
out of my mouth. Ah.
the 70s, I knew people in town that worked there. And I
Yeah,
didn't appreciate, I was so young. I mean, my first game was in 67 when I was a little kid. And so, that was the baseball play. And people, I think we kind of took it for granted because of course it was making baseballs. But
yeah.
it's nice to know the structure is still there. I hope there's a plaque on it. That should really be in the historic registry. I wonder.
I think it is.
Okay.
And also there is a display at the museum down at South Natick. At
okay.
the South Natick Library. And I did have one story that a lot of times what they would do is they would send out barrels of baseballs to people to work on at home. They would sew them up at home. And it would be like, somebody had said that in the neighborhood I'm living in now, that I'm in Holliston, so it's down a ways, but you could get this homework. And they would get a barrel with like 100 balls in it, okay, or whatever the number was. So you would make sure that that number would go back. But if they had miscounted, then you would keep those balls. And so the kids in the neighborhood would always have a supply because several people were sewing up these balls at home. So there was always a good supply of nice balls.
Wow.
So Catherine, to kind of piggyback on your question,
Yes, sir.
two falls ago, I was asked to come out to the East Coast to umpire some baseball games, some 19th century baseball games. I did Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, where they did the Doc Adams Birthplace Classic. And then the next day down in Bristol, Connecticut, they had an all-star game set up. And on my way back, we did a tour through Boston and whatnot. And on our way back, we drove into Natick and went to the museum, and it was under construction. After all that, I wanted so bad to find out more information about that figure 8 ball. And I begged and pleaded with that poor gal. I said, come on, I'm from Minnesota. I'm all the way out here. I'll never be out here again. Can you? No, we can't let you in. No. I tried as hard as I could. I said, I got a presentation. I got to fix it. I know there's something I can use to fix it. They would not let me in, not for nothing. So as Joanne said, it's like in an old church, the museum in the basement. They got a thing set up. But yeah, I cried. I was so disappointed because I wanted that information. So.
All right. Anything else for Corky?
Next time I'll sneak back in and take some pictures for you, Corky, and I'll send them along if I can, take some surreptitious secret.
Well, or even if they've got little write-ups about this the invention of this, continuous seam baseball, and anything as to why they didn't make it right away, that kind of stuff where I can avoid my speculation. I still think I'm right, but it would be nice to see that.
Okay.
But anyway, yeah, so. And Bruce, you got one of my baseballs, right?
I do. Love, wonderful gift. Thank you very much. All right. Well, next week, we're going to do this again. Same bad time, same bad channel. May 15th, we have another very special guest. I'm very honored to say that veteran baseball writer Dan Schlossberg is going to be here. And he's going to delve into the previously unknown world of baseball zeros with his book, Baseball's Memorable Misses, an unabashed look at the game's craziest zeros. That sounds like a lot of fun. I've had a chance to get through a little bit of the book. I want to get through the rest of it by the end of the week. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So next week, May 15th, 7 o'clock, sign up for it through our links on social media. If anybody has any questions, you can email me directly. But on that note, I think we'll get everybody out of here, and I will say, Corky, thanks a lot. Glad you came up to Northern New England. A little applause for Corky here.
Yeah, don't be afraid to check out YouTube, how to make a 19th century baseball. You can.
I'm going to hook up to that too. I'll link to that through our YouTube channel, so we'll have that available for you. So we'll see everybody next week. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Bruce.
Take it easy.